Hello, good morning, everyone. Very excited to be here with all of you. First of all, well, we already had an introduction about myself. My name is Fran Gómez. I come from Spain, but I've been based in Zimbabwe for the past 3 years and a half. I work for UNESCO. UNESCO, I don't know if you are familiar with it. It's the UN agency with a clear mandate on culture and heritage. We are based in Zimbabwe and we cover 9 countries in the Southern Africa region. Excellent. And I think you can see excellent. So just to say that I'm not a fashion specialist, but I'm very, very much excited about the opportunities that the fashion industry brings and what UNESCO can also bring to the picture. Probably most of you know UNESCO because of the work that we do concerning World Heritage and the protection of heritage, be it tangible or intangible. But it's also the cultural and creative industries, an area that we've been working for decades. And even if that work is not that well known, I think it really deserves everyone's attention. So let me very briefly tell you a little bit. Yes. Mm, as I was saying, we are very well known for the protection of World Heritage over the world. Congratulations to South Africa. You just got 2 new sites inscribed on the World Heritage site list only a few weeks ago. You have amazing sites in the region, but also amazing contemporary cultural expressions and living heritage. UNESCO, some 3, 4 years ago, we started one initiative to have a look at the cultural and creative industries in the continent. We started with the first report dedicated to the film industry that was launched in 2022. Today, we are going to have a look at the fashion report that was launched in October 2023 at the Lagos Fashion Week. And we are now preparing another report on the book industry. And this will follow by other ones. As you can see in the screen over there and over there, the main idea with this report is to raise awareness about the potential and the value of these sectors. UNESCO really wants to position itself and to create awareness among governmental partners, private sector, civil society, because you see that there are a number of example of initiatives and policies and partnerships that could be examined by other stakeholders in the continent to promote their own cultural industries throughout the continent. First and foremost, I want to also highlight that this report takes into consideration the diversity of the situation and the context in the different countries in Africa. We have even in the sub-region, we have countries like South Africa that it's a real powerhouse, but we also have some promising example in smaller countries like Eswatini that, for example, it has an outplus of exports in terms of the fashion industry, or the enormous population of Mozambique, for example, in the region. The report has 3 main chapters. The very first one looks at the current trends, and I will be looking at it very briefly now. The chapter number 2 talks about the main challenges, and chapter number 3 on concrete recommendations. So you see, the idea is to give an overview of what is the situation at the moment, what are the trends, what are the main barriers that prevent that this very powerful sector really takes off, and also provide very concrete recommendations. Recommendations for the sector as a whole, but also per subsector for the textile, garments, high fashion, etc., etc. And at the very end, it provides a regional snapshot for the 5 regions in Africa: northern, western, eastern, central, and southern, with a specific key data, events, and trends that give you a better idea of what is the situation. Let me go very quickly now to what are the main trends in this context at the moment. We have a dynamic and diverse ecosystems. We have the subsectors: textile, garments, high fashion, accessories, and fine crafts present in the whole continent. But with the rapid demographic expansion, some of the data that I can share with you is that by 2030, Africa will be home to 1.7 billion people, and there is a shift in the balance towards the production of African ready-made garments, both for local consumption and for the export. I also want to touch on the rich cultural significance, because from the point of view of traditional skills and also contemporary creativity, for UNESCO, and that's also the beauty of the organization I work for, we do not only see fashion as an economic sector, a very powerful economic sector that provides jobs and income generation opportunities, but it is also a vehicle of values, meaning, identity. So we do work on that very aspect. Then another of the points that the report talks about is the boom in online shopping. There is one data that I want to share with you is the share of active e-commerce customers is expected to rise by 50% in 2025. There is a continuous rise of African digital sales platform and also an increased development of the efficiency of online payment systems. There is also digital technologies, VR, AR, and all the potential for the sector. Another big opportunity is the African Free Continental Trade Area Agreement and all the opportunities that this can provide for regional and intra-regional trade. And there is also a very interesting aspect that those of you that live here, and me living in Zimbabwe, is something that we struggle with, is the implementation of a solid payment and settlement system in order to support the creation of a single market. So these are some of the issues that are prevalent in the sector. Then we do see, and we have some examples in the report about some of the initiatives of the governments and the non-governmental institutions. And we have some examples of policies and programs focused on the different facets of the fashion value chain, from supporting the garment industry through tax incentives to providing grants to fashion entrepreneurs. We also see, and this is mostly the NGO sector that has created in the past years, hubs, incubators, and accelerators that are quite important when we talk about the provision of equipment and skills. So these are some of the points that I wanted to raise concerning the current trends. Then I would like to show you some of the current challenges that we are facing. The first one is the patchwork of support policies concerning that are in place in most of the countries. This is not exclusive to the fashion sector, but we normally see that governments, we do have different ministries that are taking care of different aspects, and normally when they develop policies, either they do not coordinate among themselves, or they do not work together in order to develop and implement solid policies and measures. There is also a lack of solid data and statistics. And this is something that also with this report we are trying to unveil and uncover and to show the importance of having this information. Because without solid data and statistics, it is very difficult to develop policies and measures that really target the main barriers and challenges that are faced by the sector. Then there are insufficient implementation of intellectual property rights in the fashion sector. There is, on the one hand, limited enforcement capacities of the national agencies in charge of copyright and intellectual rights. Then there is also a lack of capacity of entrepreneurs to know how to register their brands or how to access support in this regard. I don't know if you are familiar, but there are two regional intellectual property organizations in the continent, ARIPO and OAPI. One of them mostly dealing with English-speaking countries, OAPI dealing with French-speaking Africa, but they also share an important number of challenges themselves in order to be able to monitor and to facilitate the implementation of intellectual property policies in the region. Then, and this is something that maybe you are very familiar with, it's the gaps in the fashion education and training. In the report, we look at an important number of schools and programs in the continent. However, many of them do not have accredited training programs, and with some curriculum that it's not internationally competitive, or that look oversight, or that they fail to meet the industry needs and standards. And sometimes they focus mainly on the creative part, leaving aside the other parts of the fashion industry. And we really note that the informal apprenticeships and on-the-job training remains one of the most important means of fashion education and training in the continent. Then I also wanted, and this is a big topic, the lack of structured investments and infrastructure. And there is an important section dedicated to this. We talk about the importance of having significant capital in order for fashion entrepreneurs to foster product development, marketing, brand building, expand production capacities and access to new markets. There is a lack of financing opportunities. Very little investments can be done in research and development initiatives, and this prevents brands from scaling up. Also, there is the issue about inadequate infrastructure. This and I have some data, interesting data here, for example, that despite the big production, for example, of cotton in the continent, only between 2 and 3% is processed in the continent. So despite the amazing availability of raw resources in the continent, still most of the raw material, textile, needs to be imported. Issues of inflation, fluctuation of prices, additional cost and production times, outdated machinery and limited automation, this really prevents a development of the sector concerning infrastructure. And then last but not least, there are specific market challenges and environmental concerns. There is no secret, and we've been discussing about how polluting the industry is one of the top polluting industries together with transport and energy. There is high carbon footprint, waste pollution, and biodiversity loss associated to the fashion industry, but this is very many times fueled by unsustainable models of consumption, in which we base the practice on buy, use, dispose. And there is also an issue that I think it's mostly East Africa that it's affected, and it's the large amounts of imported second-hand clothes. And on the one hand, while we consider that having in mind recycling and having recycling as part and parcel of how the industry functions, there is a huge imbalance on how Africa is taking the majority of the exports of used clothing in the world, and how this affects how the industry works. So this is a huge issue that the report also looks at. And now, to finish, I would like to take you to some of the recommendations that the report puts. There are some overarching recommendations for foundational and transversal policies. And as you can see, very much of these recommendations, they are obviously linked to the challenges that had been identified. So if, for example, concerning policies, we were talking about lack of coordination, lack of intellectual property legislation, lack of data collection. This is some of the points that we are calling governments. Let's remember that UNESCO is an intergovernmental organization. We serve our member states, we advise, we provide technical advice to governments. So this is one of the duties also of this report, to support them in advancing policy that it's based on evidence, and that's why we were discussing before about the importance of proper data and statistics on the sector. Then, and this is another important point, is the ensuring fair remuneration and decent work in the fashion sector. When we talk about decent work conditions, we are talking about basic medical care, health insurance, income protection during non-working period, insurance schemes, parental leave or disability. So this is some of the issues that we are looking at. No industry can develop in an inclusive, sustainable manner if it doesn't protect the people that work in it. So together with decent working conditions, there is also a push for the need to protect the representation and organizational rights of the workers in the industry, and that's why the promotion of unions, chambers of commerce, professional associations, trade councils is very much supported as part of the recommendations of this report. Then when we were talking about the need to promote structured investments and infrastructure development, we first need to look at creating an enabling and attractive business environment. We need to have a holistic approach to this. We need to take a look at all the different subsectors and all the different stakeholders in order to attract investments, foster innovation, and promote entrepreneurship. So improvement of access to financing opportunities for micro, small, and medium enterprises is a must, especially putting some special attention to the situation of women and youth. We were talking also about facilitation of regional and international trade, especially in the context of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and the opportunities that this will bring. Just to give you some examples, but maybe later when we talk with Shanghai, I will have an opportunity to also to give you some specific information about some of the partnerships and initiatives that UNESCO is starting in the region. We have recently started some work with SADC Secretariat based in Gaborone, with the support of the German cooperation to support trade in services, particularly looking at the culture and heritage and tourism sectors. So this is some specific work that we are starting to do. It's at a very initial stage, also because the African Continental Free Trade Agreement has just been ratified very recently. Governments now are talking among themselves about what are the priorities. Trade in services is high up on the agenda. Tourism also, since it's one contributor to the GDP in many countries in the continent, is also an aspect to be looked into. So I remember some of the conversations that I have had with colleagues at SADC Secretariat. Fashion industry is also one of the main industry sectors that they are looking at, particularly from the service and the potential that it has in the continent to favor intra-regional and regional trade. And then I would like to, we were discussing about leading the way for sustainable fashion. So we were talking about the ecosystem and the unsustainable model that imperates now in the world. So one way for the African fashion industry to stand out is to integrate sustainability in textile waste management, culture of reuse and resale, followed by recycling and repurposing. And it's important to take into consideration international norms and good practices, including for the United Nations Alliance for Sustainable Fashion. So you see, UNESCO is not the only, of course, agency dealing with this type of issues. A number of agencies are looking at the fashion sector, and UNESCO, for example, depending on the different angle, we are establishing partnerships depending on the type of work that we want to deliver. There are also some interesting initiatives with ILO, the International Labour Organization, concerning decent work conditions. There is also some interesting work, and probably most of you are familiar with the initiative of the African Development Bank, Fashionomics. So there are a number of initiatives in this regard going on. And then the last part of the recommendations, it's a set of recommendations specific per subsector. So there are specific recommendations for the textile, garment, high fashion, accessories, and fine crafts. And then, as I said, it finishes with an overview of the regional trends, key data, and events. So let me stop here and let me thank you again for your attention, and I will be happy to start this conversation with Shingai. Thanks.
Hello. Thank you so much. Thank you for that really in-depth presentation and the findings. This was actually the first report that UNESCO has done on the African fashion industry. So, and it's so hard to get information and statistics about what is actually going on in our continent. So I do encourage you to go online, download the report. It's very comprehensive. It's about 84 pages outlining different aspects of the industry. So what I wanted to chat with you now is to sort of have a focus on what the designers are asking and the questions they have, because they would like to get involved and they would like to know how exactly is UNESCO taking it forward from this point onwards. You've done the report, so let's talk about the partnerships. What's the work that's coming after the report?
Excellent. Thank you so much. No, and that's why also I'm super excited to be in such a fora to meet people from the industry, people from civil society, from the government. I think it's really this type of exchange that make us really realize about what needs to be done, what is there to be done, and what are the possibilities to engage in more partnerships. Very concretely, and I'm not sure if you are familiar, but UNESCO has been working with the fashion industry already for a number of years. There are, for example, some leading partnerships with some couture firms, international ones. There is one, for example, that was started, if I'm not mistaken, in 2017 with Chanel. It's the Chanel UNESCO partnership. There is also the Dior for Women. These are really looking at opportunities for increase and enhance the skills, particularly of women, particularly from Africa. So I would really encourage you to have a look at our website for more information. Every year there are calls for expressions of interest or applications to be part of this type of programs. They provide, especially young women, even if there are other initiatives, with coaching and mentoring opportunities. So these are some of the initiatives that my colleagues in Paris are developing at the moment. Here in Southern Africa, I'm super happy to share with you some information about the work that I've been doing since I arrived here in the region. This was with Japanese funding. We started this initiative in 2022. It's called Resiliart Accelerator, and it's basically an initiative to promote young women entrepreneurship in the cultural and creative industries in the African continent. The pilot was implemented in Zimbabwe. We selected 5 young women based in Zimbabwe, and for 6 months we provided coaching and mentoring opportunities. One of the participants, Yolanda, who came from Bulawayo in the south of the country, she works in the fashion sector. It was a really, really interesting initiative because also the way that it was conceptualized. The mentoring opportunities and the idea with this networking of young women, we decided that it was important for us to strengthen this network of young women based in the continent. It's most of the times that African women need to go to Europe or need to go to North America. This time we decided that we would put these young women in touch with other African women based in the continent. So for example, Yolanda was matched with a fashion designer, a prominent fashion designer from Nigeria, and this was not expected as part of the initiative, but thanks to this connection that she made, she participated in Lagos Fashion Week. She was exposed to people like you. So that literally changed her professional life and her personal life. And we are really hopeful about this initiative and how we can really continue developing in the future.
Absolutely. I also wanted to touch on sustainability. You mentioned it in your report, and this is always a conversation amongst designers and students and educators that we do believe that Africa is intrinsically sustainable, and the parts of our industry that aren't sustainable are the things that we've imported from bad practices elsewhere. Do you have, from your observations of what is happening in the West and in the South, what are we doing right, and what can we keep doing more of?
No, thanks. And the report has some examples about what is Africa doing right. Remember that I told you at the very beginning that UNESCO is mostly known for our work on protecting heritage. And heritage is not only about monuments, about tangible heritage, about old buildings. It's also about living heritage. I'm talking about know-how, about skills, about rituals. UNESCO has a very important program on protecting and safeguarding, and most importantly, transmitting living heritage. And in this report, we have some examples of living heritage related to the fashion industry that are recognized already in the continent. There are some examples from Egypt, for example, about some ancestral, traditional techniques and know-how that has been transmitted generation to generation, and UNESCO is trying to, on the one hand, to protect it. There's been a lot of controversy over the years and quite interesting examples about how big labels are quote unquote appropriating some patterns, some techniques, some know-how. So what UNESCO wants to do here is first to recognize that there are some local communities, that there are some individuals whose knowledge has been transmitted generation to generation, and this needs to be protected and acknowledged. So that's step number one. And one important thing is to recognize that, recognize the value of these techniques and know-how, of this living heritage. And the second one, and in a very practical manner, is like there is a market out there, there is a business world out there. What do we do with it? If we just protect something, at the end, it will become irrelevant because people would not identify with it, people would not value it. So this is a very interesting conversation. I don't think there is any right or wrong
answer.
but at the same time, I think it would be important to bring everyone around the table and having always in mind the importance to acknowledge that there are local communities whose heritage, whose know-how needs to be recognized and valued, and how can we empower them so they can benefit of this living heritage.
And not just benefit off the living heritage, but also figure out how to monetize it, because that forms part of the sustainability story, which is keeping businesses in business. So we really appreciate UNESCO facilitating conversations, opening doors and partnerships that designers and brands and education systems get a chance to not just interact within the continent, but you're doing an amazing job collaborating on the continent and finding partnerships outside of the continent to keep these businesses running and relevant and loved. So thank you so much for this presentation. Thank you for sitting on the panel.
So
I don't know
much.
if we have any questions from the audience for Francesco, anyone who would be interested in more information on UNESCO. Please go to the website. Please follow them on LinkedIn. When these opportunities come, they always post there and you can register early for those. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Concentrated can be easy if we want.
Yes.
If we want. Babe, your heart is a rhythm, my rhythm.
No problem. Hi there. Thank you so much. It was a great presentation. Excuse me. I was saying that the DTIC has got a film incentive and also a fashion incentive. And I was wondering if UNESCO has had a chance to engage with the DTIC because from a manufacturing standpoint, we know that a lot of fabric manufacturing and a lot of print has moved to China. And actually, they're trying to get some of that to come back. And it would be great to engage with UNESCO about how we can actually do that as fashion designers to get that activity to come back to the continent. So just wanted to ask if there's been any
I can
engagement
actually
with
answer
UNESCO
that.
at
Sure,
point.
yes, absolutely. The lady with the, thank you. So within South Africa, we actually are quite privileged compared to a lot of the other African countries that there are bodies that are dedicated to working within design. So you've mentioned the DTIC, which is one of them. CETA is another partner that you can approach. But if you're in Johannesburg, the Craft Design Institute is your absolute best resource in finding out what we are doing textile-wise. They literally have studios just by Constitution Hill, where artists are actually working out of there, attending workshops and trying to reclaim some of the artistic value of our textiles, our arts, our manufacturing. They also have resources for people and milliners who exist right now in South Africa who are producing fabrics, so that you designers choose them as their first point of call when sourcing fabrication. Unfortunately, since 2009, 2008, 2009, when we had our first big recession as millennials, we saw a lot of the textile industry closing down and a lot of that manufacturing going overseas. However, what has been doing very well is our garment manufacturing, Cape Town especially. We have head offices of our big retailers like Fashini, Truworths, Cape Union Mart, and specifically Fashini has been since 2004 manufacturing locally. But Truworths, Woolworths, Cape Union Mart, these big retailers, if you look on the inside of your garments on the wash care labels, you will see that a lot of the garments are actually now being made in Africa, specifically here in Cape Town and in Lesotho. So we are bringing it back. It is a slow process, but information is what most designers need to find access to these milliners. They're not always visible. And the institutions, I recommend going to the Craft Design Institute. There's an office in Cape Town. There's an office in Johannesburg. They want to interact with you. They're looking for designers. They not only look for opportunities to teach you, but they also partner up with different governments and organizations like the UNESCO to actually put together panels and talks and opportunities for local designers to work with other institutions that want to support you. They're a great connector. Yes, Kim, please. This is Kim from Vidisa, if anyone is looking at education.
Thank you so much. As Shingai mentioned, I'm Kim Gershon from Vidisa. I'm the academic director there. And I'm very interested, you spoke a lot about heritage preservation. And then in the report, you also spoke about formal education, and there's being a bit of a gap there. And I know a lot of us have been doing research in how do we go further north into Africa with formal education. I think we have quite a strong system in South Africa with a lot of legislation that keeps it up to standard. And I'm very interested in how UNESCO could potentially get involved in the education on heritage, but also who would be teaching, because it's incredibly important to understand the source of that heritage and not just handing it over to anybody. I think it's incredibly important opportunity to develop heritage education with the right communities and individuals, but working with your education institutions in the same manner. It's an amazing opportunity for potential partnerships.
No, thank you so much for this question and this comment. We work a lot, but not enough. UNESCO, we do have a culture sector. This is where I work, but we also have a sector dedicated to education. Many times we do not work together, and this is something that needs to change, and we are trying to address. There are some initiatives out there. That's why it's so important to have this type of conversations and to learn about what are the gaps, like the report was mentioning. But we do have some interesting initiatives in the region talking about heritage education. There are some countries like Zimbabwe, for example, that adopted few years ago a heritage-based education, mostly targeting primary school. That was a law that was passed, but no one knew how to implement it. And when you would talk to curriculum developers, when you would talk to teachers, they would not know what this means. What is heritage? What do we mean? How do we teach heritage? So this is something that we started working, piloting in Namibia and Zimbabwe, working on what type of heritage, how to also work with other stakeholders, because it's also not only about teacher-learner relationship, it's how we bring other stakeholders. In the case of living heritage, when we are talking about the role of local communities, community leaders, this is something that we are working on, how to develop lesson plans together with the community. So this is one initiative that we are already working on, that we bring together culture and education. Going back to the topic of today, fashion, interesting point, we are starting, probably we are gonna be kick-starting this initiative on the return and restitution of cultural property to Southern Africa with the University of Pretoria and the African Union. And what makes this innovative is that for the very first time, UNESCO is partnering with a higher education institution in order to develop an educational program on how to address this issue. I know that return restitution of cultural property, it's not the topic of this, but this is something that UNESCO works on, that for many, many decades, we had followed a very specific approach, working with governments, working with communities. But this is the first time that we are thinking like there is a gap there on education. What is the most relevant program that we can start in order to address the problems? How do we do things differently? So the very same way that we are doing it for return restitution, I can see UNESCO supporting the fashion sector in identifying the gaps, bringing people together. So I will be very happy to further discuss about this if ever. Thanks.
Thank you, Kim.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for this interesting presentation. My name is Sisi Dangarembwa. I'm Zimbabwean. And thank you also for mentioning Zimbabwe's heritage-based education. I wanted to engage with that a little bit, and I wanted to find out how far UNESCO is involved in ensuring that this heritage-based education is not a political ploy, but it is actually a system that is meant to and does benefit the citizens. This has a relationship to fashion. I run a women's film festival in Zimbabwe, which ended on Saturday. And I used to have a fashion show because of the relationship, obviously, between film and fashion. I've had to let that go. And one of the reasons is because of, can I say, the government's attitude towards my work. And so I wanted to find out from you, UNESCO, how you balance these kinds of tensions between governments and citizens to make sure that the work you do does not end up simply benefiting governments, but also impacts positively on citizens and their ability to sustain themselves, for example, in the fashion world.
No, super interesting question. Also, but I have an example, and I have an example from your country on how UNESCO is also trying to do things differently. We've been working for the past 2 years and a half on the Great Zimbabwe World Heritage Site, one of the most iconic archaeological sites in the continent, based in the south of Zimbabwe. And since I arrived there, we were talking about what is the story that we want to communicate? What are the narratives? What is the storytelling? And many times, and I don't know if you agree, in Zimbabwe, when I went around the country, many times the narratives that we still see there, 40 years after independence, is still colonial narratives. What we wanted to make sure, and this also applies to fashion, because fashion, as I said at the very beginning, it's also a conveyor and a vehicle of meaning and values. It's we didn't want to replace one narrative, one colonial narrative, for another univocal narrative. So it's all about the approach. It's all about how do we engage the different voices, many times silenced voices. In Great Zimbabwe, for example, no one was asking what was the role of women, the role of youth, the role of migrants, the role of silenced voices. Other perspectives, other stakeholders that were not taken into consideration. So we took our time. It took quite some time because it's not easy to break just one viewpoint. And it's all about bringing a space so people are invited to speak up, to bring their perspectives, and to share what is important. Why is, for example, in that case, Great Zimbabwe still important, relevant for local communities or for Zimbabweans today as a symbol in the struggle for independence, dignity, pride, etc., etc. So all of this, I think it could be applied to the whole cultural and arts realm, and it's all about new storytelling, new narratives, and bringing other voices to the fore. I don't know if you agree.
And just speaking of the collaborative efforts that you had with your initiative, how can someone like her work with you in Zimbabwe in order for her to revive this film and fashion festival? Because from what I understood is that you also were struggling with the relationship building between investors, stakeholders, government, and you. So is UNESCO a place that she could approach to try and get those initiatives, sort of as an intermediary to get those relationships to work more smoothly?
What I like about UNESCO is that normally we are perceived as an honest broker. And in the case of Zimbabwe, I think Zimbabwe is particularly special in the region because of the situation. And one of the good things is when two parties cannot, for whatever reason, sit on the same table or cannot interact, many times we have that power. And we have seen that in the past when one specific governmental partner that has a difficult relationship with the current government in Zimbabwe, UNESCO can always facilitate this type of conversation. So I would definitely invite people to approach us and use us in that regard.
I think those are all the questions we have from the audience. Thank you so much. I hope you found this as informative as I have. Please look for us walking around the showroom network exchange numbers. If anyone would like more information about UNESCO, please find me and contact me, and I will facilitate. He will point me in the right direction on how to help you with the right person at the organizations. Thank you so much.